screen. A few other additional housekeeping messages for you. Please use the chat function to ask any questions or if you've got any queries. We are looking for engagement through the session, so don't be shy. We welcome questions. The meeting will be locked 15 minutes after the presentation begins. And for members of IOSH Hong Kong branch, due to CPD requirements here in Hong Kong, if anyone joins after the 15 minutes, we won't be issuing CPDs for the time of the session. So again, welcome. I believe we have people from Singapore, from the UK, and from Hong Kong. So that's fantastic. So please don't be shy, answer questions. We do welcome those. So now I'm going to hand over to Adele, who is going to start the session, and that will be followed by her fellow colleague, Lucy. So please welcome Adele, the Health and Safety Manager at WWF.
Morning, everybody. I'm just going to put the presentation up. Okay. Can everybody see that? Okay. Lovely. I'm getting nods. Marvelous. So thank you, Sarah. So as you said, my name's Adele, and I'm the head of safety management at the Wildfowl Wetland Trust. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us this morning. So as Sarah said, this is a double act. I'm going to be doing the first bit of the session, and then my colleague Lucy will take over. As Sarah said, please do ask us questions. We'd welcome them, and we'll make sure there's some time at the end to cover those. So there's lots of pictures in our presentation today. So for those of you who've not visited any of our sites in the UK, you can get an idea of what they look like. So the Wildfowl Wetland Trust is the UK's leading conservation charity. And I need to, there we go. And it was founded by Sir Peter Scott in 1946. There's a photo of him there, of his house at Slimbridge in Gloucestershire. And he's recognised as one of the founders of modern conservation. He was the son of the Antarctic explorer, Captain Scott, and he was an Olympic athlete, an award-winning painter, and he was also a broadcaster as well. So he was a very, very busy man. He founded the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust in 1946, but he also created WWF as well, the charity, and he did create the panda logo for that charity. He also created the IUCN Red List, and that is a list of endangered species that's recognised throughout the world. So people in the conservation sector can gather information to feed into that list, so we know which species are threatened and endangered. So why wetlands? Here's some lovely photos of two of our sites here. The top left is our site, Sturt Marshes in Somerset, and there's also a picture of our site in London as well. They look very, very beautiful, but actually wetlands are really, really important. They cover less than 1% of the world's surface, but 40% of all species rely on them. In the UK, it's about 3% of our land is wetlands, but it's home to about 10% of our species. They're incredibly effective as carbon sinks. So, for example, peatland covers 3% of the world's planet, but it stores about 1/3 of all of the land-based carbon in the world. And then in coastal areas, coral reefs and mangroves, they absorb storm surges and tsunamis. And then inland wetlands soak up rain, which helps to reduce flooding and delay droughts. So wetlands are critical for climate adaptation and building resilience. So nearly 35% of the world's wetlands were lost between 1970 and 2015, so a huge loss. And wetlands are lost 3 times faster than forests across the world. And you can see we've got this statement on the screen here. Wetlands are the most effective carbon sinks on our planet. So we've got a lot of work to do at WWT in getting those messages across. In terms of who we are, in the UK, we have 10 sites. 9 of those are wetland centres that they have visitor centres. People can come and enjoy themselves and walk around. We've also got Sturt Marshes, the picture that I showed you before, which doesn't have a visitor centre, but is a nice open nature reserve that people can walk around. We have approximately 350 full-time equivalent staff and around about 1,000 volunteers. We have 3,500 hectares of wetland habitat that we directly manage, and about 50,000 school children come to our centres every year to learn about wetlands and why they're so important. We have 200,000 WWT members who we're very, very grateful for their support, and about 1 million visitors a year to our 10 sites. So lots and lots of work going on. 7 of our 10 sites are licensed zoos as well. So we do have zoo licenses, and 8 of our sites have national and or international designations. So they're sites of special scientific interest, or they are what's called a Ramsar site, which is a wetland of international importance. Excuse me. We have 7 centres in England, 1 in Wales, 1 in Scotland, and 1 in Northern Ireland. So we're very much spread about, and each site is slightly different, but they are all wonderful in their own way. And Lucy and I are very lucky because we get to go and visit them. We also do international work as well. So we advise in the UK and internationally on wetland projects and visitor centres. Our conservation team travel all over the world. We have a particular focus in Cambodia. We have a team there. We also have a team in Madagascar. And we don't have a team based in Arctic Russia, but we do a lot of work in Russia, particularly with regards to swans. So that's just an introduction to WWT. In terms of health and safety, I have to make sure I link everything into the WWT mission. So our mission, it's up there to conserve, restore and create wetlands, save wetland wildlife and inspire everyone. And how the health and safety work plan feeds into that mission is primarily about engaging staff and volunteers and visitors around health and safety, and ensuring there is a positive health and safety culture. We need to make sure that we assess our performance on our journey, and making sure that myself and all the health and safety work that we do is supporting the work of our staff and volunteers who are doing all the amazing and exciting things regarding wetlands. And I need to make sure that our visitors and our school children who come and visit us as well are able to actively enjoy wetlands and interact with nature in a way that is suitably risk managed. And of course, making sure good health and safety, we're using resources more wisely. We are a charity after all. So each of the sites has a safety, health and environment officer based at that site, and they report to the site lead, the site manager. But they support Lucy and I and all the other managers in the trust. They are a point of communication, liaison and coordination. They attend our Safety, Health and Environment Committee They support Lucy and I's work programs. They help us coordinate our accident and incident returns and help us with investigations. And then they provide Lucy and I and others with information when we are auditing the sites. And then myself, I'm supported by a number of external contractors. So we have external people come and support me with regards to food safety, tree safety, place safety, fire, asbestos, Legionella, those kind of things. So it's a team effort. So what risks are there at WWT? Let's start off with our visitors. So we have all ages come and visit us, all people in different stages of health. We're doing a lot of work to encourage people to get out into our wetlands and enjoy natural spaces. It's very good for your well-being, as well as us being able to get those important conservation messages over. So when they're going round our sites, enjoying their visit, they don't want to be thinking about health and safety. It's kind of needs to be in the background and allow them to enjoy their day. So things like play safety. We do have play areas for the children. We have a lot of events and activities. We have building works that go on our sites. They are live sites. There are people, there are wildlife, there are our zoo collection animals, and we need to make sure that the building work is not putting the health and safety of people and animals at risk. And then food safety as well. So our sites do have restaurants and cafes at them as well. So for the staff and volunteers, we're very much managers of our land. I mentioned we've got 3,500 hectares of beautiful wetlands that we manage. So there's a lot of tractor driving, there's a lot of chainsaws, in managing the land for our wildlife. So machinery and equipment safety is number one on there. Driving safety, so whether you're driving a tractor or a ride-on lawnmower, or whether, like myself, you are driving on the motorway to visit different sites, you might be driving in other countries. Working outside, those of you in the UK know what our weather is like, so our staff are outside in all weathers, boiling hot, freezing cold, wind, rain, everything that can be chucked at them. Manual handling, so moving and handling different things, including animals as well, which links into the next point, so working with our animals. Our restaurant and cafe staff are obviously using knives, and they're working with hot things coming out of the oven, so cut by sharp objects and burns and scalds. And then our international teams, we are just starting to see some international travel happen with our staff. Obviously, that's stopped for quite some time due to COVID-19 restrictions, but we are seeing the travel starting up again. So making sure that people are safe when they're traveling. And then also a lot of the work that we do, particularly in Cambodia, Madagascar and Russia, is very, very remote. So they will fly to a city, but then they will have quite a long journey out to work in a very remote area that's far away from medical services, for example. And then everyone, whether it's staff, volunteers or visitors, they are working or enjoying their visit near water. So there's a lot of work that we do around water safety. Also what's called zoonosis, and those are diseases that can be passed from animals to humans. Slips, trips, falls, as you might imagine, people are outside in a natural environment. Our estates risks, we've got a number of buildings, so asbestos, Legionella, fire, and tree safety as well. So I just wanted to introduce you to the Visitor Safety Group. We are a very proud member of that group. And it was set up over 20 years ago by some organisations that wanted to share knowledge, expertise, best practice. And it's very much set up for landowners and organisations who manage the safety of visitors in the countryside, but it could also be parks and what we call heritage environments. So things like stately homes, castles, those kind of things. So quite a variety. And managing visitor safety in a very wild environment, you can see an example photo on here from one of our members. It's very, very different to how you would manage health and safety traditionally with members of the public. Different groups of the public expect different levels of risk. There are shared responsibilities, so between the landowner and the people visiting. There may be a lack of direct control of the visitor. So if you're in a very wild environment, you could go hours and hours or perhaps days without seeing a member of staff. General health and safety law in the UK is very good, but it's not really set up for this kind of situation. And because of that, there was felt to be a lack of guidance from our enforcement bodies, from our regulators. And that's one of the reasons that the group was set up. And then also you may have what we call heritage or environmental constraints. So pretty much all of our members will have some legal restrictions about what they can and cannot do on their sites. If you take a castle, for example, you can't just put lots of handrails in everywhere. It's a listed building. You're not allowed to do that. In some of our very wild environments, you may have environmental constraints. So you can't be putting lots of tarmac paths in and those kind of things, because it will damage the beautiful countryside and the plants and the wildlife that live there. So we have some fundamentals in the visitor safety group of how we approach managing visitor safety. And these are the sort of key things that we try and have in our minds at all time. So take into account conservation, heritage, recreation, culture, and landscape objectives. And not taking away people's sense of freedom and adventure. We want people to access the countryside. We want people to enjoy themselves, whether it's walking, cycling, hiking, mountaineering, swimming, whatever it is they are doing. We want to give them that sense of freedom, and we want to try and avoid, where possible, restrictions on access to the countryside. And it is a partnership approach, as I said, between us as landowners and the people visiting us, and people taking part in activities will accept different levels of risk. So are you somebody who is very experienced, trained, you're an expert in your field, or are you a family just wanting a day out and a walk around? So risk control measures for one visitor group may create risks to others. And that's something we have to really bear in mind. And this is a really good example here on this photo. Canals and rivers where you have lots of different groups of people using it. So people who live on the canal or river, people enjoying, you've got people in boats here. You might have people walking, cycling, dog walking, riding a horse by a river or canal. All of these different groups of people may create risks to others. So we need to work with those different visitor groups to make sure there's understanding and try and reduce conflict. That can be tricky at times. And there is a shared responsibility. So striking that balance between the visitors coming in and having being self-reliant, and us as landowners intervening and putting in place risk controls. It's reasonable to expect our visitors to exercise responsibility for themselves and to not put others at risk as well. And if, for example, you are a parent, it's reasonable to expect that you will supervise your children or other people that are in your care. But what we need to do as land managers is make sure there is an awareness. So ensuring that visitors know what risks that they face, they're informed, they're educated, and then they can make a decision. So a really good example of this is some work that the Visitor Safety Group have been doing around mountain biking trails, and they have been working to grade them in a similar way to ski runs. So you can see on this sign here that it's giving information that these are very challenging routes ahead for experienced riders, and that it's graded as a black trail, so the most severe. So, you know, this trail is suitable for sort of, you know, the top 10% elite mountain bikers. It's not a family trail. There are other ones. So what we call this, to sort of sum this up, is no nasty surprises. The visitor is informed and they can make a decision as to whether they proceed and how they interact with our site. It's important, however, as land managers, we do have legal responsibilities to assess risks, to develop visitor safety plans, and then regularly monitor the behaviour and experiences of our visitors to feed that into the review of those visitor safety plans. Our risk control measures should be consistent so that the public feel empowered when they're walking around or undertaking activities. And our risk control measures should also take into account the benefits to wider society. So we certainly want to encourage school children to come on to all of our sites and have that education and that information and the conservation messages. We don't want to stop those just because it's a wild environment. But if, for example, we are doing lots of building works, we need to make sure that our work activities do not expose visitors to serious risk. So you've got a picture of some scaffolding there. A number of our members are in the forestry industry, so they have to do tree works and forestry activities that involve huge pieces of machinery. And we need to make sure that those visitors to that forest on that day are not being exposed to a serious risk. So apologies if this is quite hard to read, but this sort of sums up how we manage risk in the visitor safety group. And so what you do on the top, you look at how developed your site is. So on the left, is it undeveloped? So very wild, rugged countryside, remote forests, very low visitor numbers because it is so remote. Then on the right-hand side, you've got very heavily developed. So that would be a park that's within a city, for example. It's very flat, there's lots of paths everywhere, easy access to cafes and those kind of things. There's staff on site, you have high visitor numbers. So where are you as a landowner on that spectrum? Then you look at the level of visitor skill, self-reliance and personal responsibility. So would you expect your visitors to have good personal safety skills? Are your visitors planning in advance, that, you know, they're coming prepared with the equipment that they need, suitable clothing, an understanding of what to do if they get into trouble? So the visitors are accepting responsibility for their own safety. Or on the other hand, is it minimal? So we're inviting young children, families, elderly people, people with no previous experience of visiting the countryside. But you might need to support them and give them advice and information about how to act responsibly. Or are you somewhere in the middle? So you look at those two things, your site and what your visitors are like, and then that determines the level of management intervention that you need. So if you have a very wild, remote site, you know, a mountain or something like that, and the very low visitor numbers, the people who are visiting are very experienced, they're trained, they've got all of their equipment and things, they're very self-sufficient, then your level of management intervention will be low. So we're not going to have lots of handrails, we're not going to have good paths, we will give basic information, but that's probably it. On the other hand, if you've got a very heavily developed site, like an urban park, where all different groups of people are coming, more advanced physical safety measures, so things like handrails, paths everywhere, tarmac paths, excuse me, warning signs, advanced information about what people can expect, regular staff presence on site. So it's a slightly different way of looking at health and safety law for these quite different environments that we have, and determining what level of intervention we need and how we support our visitors. So it's a really, really good group. I get a lot from it. It's definitely a supportive network. If you want to know any more information, if you just go on to Google and search visitor safety group, it will come up. Please do have a look. Or if you'd like to get in touch with me for more information, please do so. So that's my section of the presentation. And I'm going to hand you over now to my colleague, Lucy. Lucy, just let me know when you want me to change slides.
Thank you very much, Adele. Can I just check, can you hear me? Brilliant, lovely. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to attend today. Very exciting to be talking to people across the world. Good morning, good afternoon. Lucy Smith, Head of Sustainability at WWT. I work closely with Adele, as Adele's mentioned. We also had various other heads, head of legal and head of reserves management, and we all work very closely together. In terms of sustainability, what it is, I lead at WWT with support of many others on environmental sustainability. Sustainability is about achieving the sweet point or balance between environmental, social and economic prosperity, I suppose. There is technically a sweet point where all those things are met, which is what true sustainability is. Historically, there used to be a model of 3 pillars. Sustainability was the top of the 3-pillared approach, but increasingly and arguably you could now suggest that it's more of a hierarchy, with the biosphere and the planet at the bottom, and then society above that and the economy above that. Without people, there is no economy, but without the planet, there is no people and there is no financial progress or prosperity. So this is broadly what my role is at WWT, is trying to achieve that sweet point. It's getting about the balance, so having our needs met today, but without compromising future generations. But I'm looking at the environmental side of things, because we need as a charity to be financially sustainable, i.e. to survive. So therefore, I just broadly deal with the environmental side of things. Next slide, please. As with Adele's safety management strategy, we have environmental policies and strategies at WWT. You can see them at the link at the bottom, or obviously contact me for any more information. But my remit broadly across the organisation is to support on managing our negative environmental impacts. As an organisation, we have many, many positive benefits that we bring to the environment in terms of trying to restore or prevent the deterioration of wetlands, bringing people closer to wildlife, changing behaviours, maybe making people buy peat-free compost, having a wetland pond, getting involved, lobbying their MP. They're all very positive things environmentally that we aim and hope to reach, as well as having a good time, obviously, but they're quite a lot harder to measure. But in doing those positive things, we have a potentially negative impact. Our visitors travel, we have staff, we have buildings and sites that Adele's given an introduction to. We have shops and restaurants that sell things and make things, we generate waste. So my job is to try and manage and minimize the impacts of those things to ensure the process of continuous improvement. It's any of you have heard of the Denning cycle. It's plan, do, check, act. It's that continuous improvement. You don't do something and then you put your feet up, you keep going. I try and embed sustainability into everything we do. So other organizations and teams might have a policy or a strategy, but I need to try and make sure that sustainability is inherent within that, i.e. embedding it. 4 of the broad principles we look at are legal compliance. I imagine you're all, as IOSH members, very aware of health and safety legislation. There is a huge amount of environmental legislation from Europe, within the UK, and increasingly across the different countries within the UK, as countries within the UK separate how they're doing things. So I have to try and keep up with that. We've got legislation around water, waste, energy, agricultural land because of our land holdings, gases, buildings, lots of different areas, and we need to be legally compliant as an organisation. Shouldn't necessarily be a challenge, but given that we are now in our 75th year and legislation changes very regularly, keeping up has sometimes been a challenge. Not intentionally not compliant, it's just there's something that will come in that's so small and below the radar that somebody would miss historically that we hadn't been aware of maybe 50 years ago. We have to set targets, measure, report and review targets for our main impact areas. Climate change, obviously particularly topical at the moment with the COP happening in Glasgow next week, the Conference of Parties. But we want to reduce our impacts, i.e. aiming for net zero in terms of our emissions, but also to adapt our buildings and activities and land holdings for climate change. Our sites are often in remote locations near to large water bodies, rivers, estuaries, streams, oceans. So they're potentially at risk of flooding, but equally, they're also at risk of drought. And our sites are wetland sites, so they need water. So how we manage our land holdings for a changing climate, the impacts on our trees, on our insects, on our reserves is key. So involved in that. And interestingly, there's a lot of research now being done that shows that visitor attractions such as WWT, when the temperature gets higher, as it is doing with global warming, visitation drops off above a certain temperature because people go to the seaside or they stay in their back garden in a paddling pool or whatever. So a lot of work in that area. And crucially, reducing our pollution risks. Adele's mentioned tractors, so we have fuel on our sites, we have heating oil at some of our sites, we use chemicals, disinfectants, we have birds, which obviously do, there's effluent associated with that. So again, something around reducing those pollution risks. Next slide, please, Adele. Thank you. So my role broadly, again, working with others, is about legal compliance, which I've mentioned the various bits of environmental legislation changing all the time. Performance, reducing our impacts, and this is a very large topic area. This might be reducing our energy use, our path to net zero. It might be the pollution prevention, reducing our water use. It could be plastics. You're all aware of the single-use plastic issues with and associated pollution and risks and pollution in the oceans and rivers. Obviously, as a visitor attraction, we want to try and reduce and need to try and reduce our use of single-use plastics, but equally we provide takeaway services where visitors come and they want to take away a cup of coffee or a sandwich, and we need to meet food hygiene requirements and give them something to put it in, which by its nature will usually be single use. So if we look for alternatives to plastics, are those alternatives actually sustainable in terms of their carbon footprint or their disposal options? So lots of things on that area. Our supply chain, we buy and sell lots of things, and we need to make sure that those things that we buy and sell are sustainable, long lasting, durable, made from the right things, and have the right message behind them. And the other area, which for me is one of the most interesting, but also the most challenging, is the hearts and minds, the behaviour change. In the main, I take behaviour change to relate to our staff and volunteers rather than our visitors, because we have a whole marketing team that deals with that side of things. But equally, I get involved in that in terms of what we're doing and some of the broader messages. Messages around peat-free compost are common to our staff when we're buying compost to use on our sites, as they are for our visitors. Next slide, please. So I think probably with what Adele said in terms of what we do as an organisation and what I've alluded to, you can get a feel for some of the impacts that we have as an organisation. Visitation, you can see in the slide our visitation in our car park here at Slimbridge in the 1960s, and you can see it today. Our sites are not well served by public transport, and equally our visitor groups are often families or large groups of people with birders, with kits that are coming together. So sometimes encouraging people to cycle or get public transport is a challenge. We have fuel, we have birds, we have breeding areas where we have heat lamps, and we have birds that we are rearing, so often very, very vulnerable species that we rear on our sites, involving lots of water and lots of energy. We have shops, we have delivery vehicles, we pump and move lots of water around, we generate waste, we use lots of paper, we provide magazines for our supporters, and we use leaflets to encourage visitors. So large number of impact areas as an organisation. Just as a guide, pre-pandemic, as an organisation, we travelled about 900,000 miles on business a year. That is reduced from previous years, but that mileage is dependent on some of the international work we're doing. If we're travelling over to conferences pre-pandemic, if we're doing work overseas to release birds in a given area, we do work with the local communities in that area, but some business travel is unavoidable. Similarly, supporting our sites throughout the UK, we want to travel and be there. We audit, we train, those sorts of areas. Water use for toilets, taps, breeding areas, waste. We've got waste obviously from offices and buildings and the visitor centres, but we've also got specialist waste from the zoo areas that we manage. So lots of different areas there. Next slide, please. But the positive thing for me is I'm building on very strong foundations. Adele mentioned Peter Scott. Peter Scott's was very, very inventive and very, very efficient in terms of what he did in terms of resource use, because he had to be. He was founding a new charity, limited resources. He wanted the money to go into the conservation work, not into some of the other activities behind the scenes. So we do have an ethos as an organisation of doing things inventively and effectively. So there's some positivities that come in, whereas maybe some organisations, they're doing lots of nice things, but scratch below the surface, there's not that much. Next slide, please. So across our site, we already have and are increasingly gaining a lot more kit and tech. I'm not going to go into a lot of these because they're boxes that sit in plant rooms that are not terribly sexy or exciting, but we have composting toilets, we have low flush glues, we have solar panels. This week, we've just put another 88 on buildings at Slimbridge, which are now generating electricity, and I'll be managing about 500 more going in across other sites this year. We have green roofs that absorb water, but also provide habitat. Most of our sites are in remote locations, which means they don't have access to foul sewers. So when you flush the loo, it doesn't go off into a sewage treatment works. We treat it on site in wetland treatment systems, which creates habitat for wildlife, lowers our carbon footprint, and is positive from an environmental point of view, provided they're maintained. We're not on mains gas at a lot of our sites, so we have to find alternatives. We have rain gardens, we have voltage optimization, we have biomass boilers at a number of our sites, we have rainwater harvesting. I can provide detail on any of these things as required. We use heat pumps at our sites, which are a little bit like a reverse fridge, so they're an electric form of heating but efficient. We're obviously looking to improve insulation. We provide cycle facilities. So all the things you're probably expecting to see at an environmental organisation such as WWT. There's much more we can and should and would be doing in this area. Just as a guide, our carbon footprint as an organisation has gone down from 1,816 tonnes in 2014 to just over 1,000 pre-pandemic. So that's a substantial reduction, but again, more that we can be doing. Next slide, please. I mentioned already about our supply chain. We buy things, we sell things, we use things, single-use plastics in our shops, fencing, benches. We often use quite a lot of recycled plastic on our sites because it lasts a lot longer. It's encouraging the supply chain, the recycling of plastics and the market for recycled plastics. It lasts longer, it needs less maintenance. Wood gets very slippery, as I'm sure you're aware, and can cause slips hazards, so we use those sorts of things. We're also looking to improve the quality of what we sell in our shops and the message behind it, most crucially, making sure that our visitors understand what we're selling and why. If we are using timber, making sure it's from sustainable and legal sources. And I mentioned already about all the marketing material and literature. You can see Waterlife, our magazine, in the middle of this image. That's now made from 100% recycled paper. It's wrapped in compostable packaging. We're looking at digitization, but a lot of our members do want to have a hard copy of things. And there's some benefit in having a hard copy in terms of passing it on to other people, donating it to doctors' surgery, so other people can understand more about WWT and what we do. Next slide, please. I mentioned one of our biggest areas is travel as an organisation. We have policies and procedures and processes around this. We encourage car sharing. We pre-pandemic used a lot of Zoom and Teams, and obviously that is one of the few positives of the pandemic, is that people are now doing more online meetings. It doesn't change and negate the need for actual travel to visit sites, but equally we're now looking at some of our routine meetings having maybe three a year by Zooms or Teams, and then one face-to-face. So it has positive benefits. People are getting used to it. But the other side of things is looking at how our visitors travel, encouraging them to cycle or use public transport, increasingly electric vehicles, car sharing for our staff and visitors. We offer discounted entry for our visitors if they've come by bicycles or public transport. For our business travel, we pay mileage rates for car sharing or cycling. We have various policies and procedures in this area, as you would expect. And overall, per member of staff, our FTE, full-time equivalent business travel, has reduced substantially, but our overall business travel remains broadly constant because we're increasing our staff numbers or increasing our workload. Next slide, please. Nearly finished here. Just in terms of, I mentioned about the awareness and behavioural change, we have an intranet called Netlands that has lots of information about sustainability on that, but that is not necessarily communicating. We have various modules within our training course. We provide guidance for new starters, but nothing beats face-to-face talking or Teams meetings. So for every new starter, we provide inductions online. And when I visit sites, I go and talk to people, because that's one of the best ways to actually raise awareness and understand people's concerns and interests and passions. Next slide, please. Sustainability at WWT is evolved over decades, and in the 5 years I've been posted, including the pandemic, one of the things we've had to do is try and develop things in a slightly structured way. But legal compliance has been the priority area, and now the net zero journey is our future essential passion now. One of the things I'm working on, though, for this current year is an environmental management system. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of those, but this is a standard way of understanding and managing and reducing your environmental impacts, whether you make widgets or whether you're a conservation organisation as different and complex as WWT, or a big organisation like Unilever or some of the organisations you may work with. It's a standardised system of understanding your impacts, managing and reducing them. At the heart of it is continuous improvement that I mentioned right at the start, and legal compliance. With these environmental management systems, you can also get them externally verified to various standards. You may have heard of ISO 14001. It's an international standard for environmental management. EMAS, the Eco Management Audit Scheme, Green Dragon, and BS 8555. I'm looking at Green Dragon, which is suitable for fairly small organisations. We're looking at our headquarters and Slimbridge, which are both on the same site where I am currently, this current year, to demonstrate to others that we understand our impacts, we're doing things to reduce them, we're compliant, and we're continuously thinking about that process to manage our specific impacts as an organisation. And we've been looking to externally have that verified verified, so we can say to others, including our staff and volunteers and supporters, we do what we say on the tin, which is important to us. Fair amount of work on that, but really positive in terms of demonstrating where we've come to and where we are going to. Next slide, please. I think it was hopefully inherent in everything Adele said, is that we all work very closely as an organisation, and Adele and I probably know more than others in many areas: environmental and safety management incidents, legal compliance, adopting a risk-based approach, looking at your biggest risk and addressing those, and then moving on to the next one, that continuous improvement, responsibility and ownership of those things. It's not down to Adele and me, we may be the heads of, but it's down to every individual to truly embed these things. Governance, we have the same reporting line. We have our SHE committee that Adele referred to earlier. We even have some crossover areas, things like nuisance. So noise can have an impact environmentally and obviously an impact on individuals, as can smoke and air quality. Adele's alluded to the visitor safety group that she works with. Within the UK, we have an organisation called Fit for the Future, which is a network of landowning conservation organisations, the Crown Estate, National Trust, ourselves and many others. And we share good practice, we share concerns, we tear our hair out together. So we're not working in isolation. That's a real overview of what we do at WWT in terms of sustainability. I'm happy to answer any questions on any other things. I can see something's come up in the chat, but I can't see the top of it at the moment. But next slide, please. It's really just back to our founder, Sir Peter Scott, with his understanding that actually it should be about quality, not quantity, having one good item rather than multiple. He understood it as an organisation, and that's where we're aiming to get. That's it from me, please. Last slide, please, Del. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you. I can see that there are a few questions in the chat. So again, if people do have more, please feel free to put them in. So Adele, I think I have a first question for you. And the question is, thanking you for the presentation, but wanting to know about first aid management at visitor centres. So how is first aid managed at a visitor centre?
Thank you. So we do have first aiders on all of our sites, and we will provide first aid for members of the public as well. We're not in the UK legally obliged to, but we obviously don't want to leave an injured person coming to visit us. So we do have first aiders. I think we're quite lucky on our sites because all of our sites have staff and volunteers on them every day. Some of our colleagues in the visitor safety group who are managing very, very wild, remote environments will not have members of staff on their sites every day, and they will not have first aid arrangements in place, but we do. So we have all of that in place. And things like in our bird hides, we will have a sign saying you are in such and such a hide, the name of it, and then there's the emergency contact number on there, so people can phone and say, you know, there's a fire, or we need a first aider. I am in X, Y, and Z hide. Thank you.
Thank you. And Adele, just moving on from that question, it's linked. There's a question in the chat from Scotty McDonald. So thank you very much. It says, with what is the level of contingency planning that is carried out in respect to emergency scenarios, e.g. fire, evacuation, ambulances, etc.?
That can be tricky because as both Lucy and I have said, we are remote locations. So getting a blue light emergency service to our sites does take some time. One of the things that we have been doing is using what 3 words. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, they've taken the whole of the planet and they've put it into 2 meter by 2 meter grids, and each of them has a unique 3-word reference. So we have been looking at what 3 words are for our gateways, our buildings, our bird hides, sheds, those kind of things, so that if we needed to get an ambulance, for example, to a certain field because somebody's had an accident on a tractor, we can say the gateway is what 3 words, such and such, and the emergency services will instantly know where that is. So it's an ongoing thing, and it's quite challenging. Yeah, I totally agree with you. What 3 words is an excellent way of identifying locations. It's universally recognised. The emergency services know about it as well, and it's just a nice, easy way of doing things. But it is a challenge, and again, for some of our peer colleagues as well, they have some very difficult terrain. You know, deep forests, mountains, where you would need a helicopter to evacuate somebody.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question in the chat for Lucy. So Lucy, Katie Graham has sent this one in, so thank you, Katie. It says, have you been able to quantify how much the environmental benefits of the charity's activities may outweigh the harmful environmental impacts?
Very, very good question. Thank you, Katie. And it's also quite a contentious one. As a conservation organisation, we want to measure things. So we do spend quite a lot of time surveying our supporters around what they've done differently and how their behaviours might have changed as a result of visiting. So we have some information on that, but it's quite difficult to compare and contrast. So are you using less water to brush your teeth? What does that mean? And how does that compare to how much water we use? So they're really quite difficult questions to answer. But the one area we're starting to look at in a lot more detail is net zero. So we know what the emissions are from our buildings and our business travel and operations. We're starting to quantify our supply chain impacts, the carbon emissions associated with that, which is called Scope 3 under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So we kind of know, and we're getting an increasing understanding of what our organizational carbon footprint is. And we also know how much our land holdings, both our sites and reserves and other land that we own that's not reserves, we know how much carbon that absorbs or sequesters. So we have that kind of balance, but what we would never want to do is effectively say, because we absorb this, we can do that. Because that land has always existed in some way, shape or form, absorbing carbon and other greenhouse gases. So we're in order to achieve our net in the net zero, one of the things we would want to do is to change the way we manage our land to increase the absorption. For some organizations, it would be planting more trees, but for us, it will be having more wetlands, healthier wetlands to sequester more carbon. So that's the only direct way of comparing things that we've got, but we have to be very careful about comparing it because it could be seen as a get out of jail, and we would not want that. Our fundamental thing on our net zero pathway is to reduce our emissions as much as we can, and then the rebalance under that net is the increased sequestration, but as part of that overall calculation, there is some comparison between our impacts and our benefits. I don't know if that answers your question, Katie, but it's a very good question.
Thank you. And Lucy, I guess just to reinforce that question, another one that we have in the chat is, what is the main benefit to a business in, I guess, developing an environmental management system? Efficiency. So each site will be doing things the same way we're not a very processy organization, which is great in terms of innovation and flexibility, but it makes it quite hard to do things efficiently. So there's an increased efficiency associated with an environmental management system. There's financial benefits that should result if you're doing things more efficiently and identifying and managing and ticking off your key impacts. Reputation benefit. And because legal compliance is an inherent part of an environmental management system, reduced reputation risks, fines associated with it. But I think reputation is probably one of the biggest benefits of an EMS. Okay, thank you. And I have a question here, which I'm going to ask you to volunteer to answer because I'm not too sure who's best placed. And there's 2 parts to this question. So thank you, Ko Ming Kee, for for giving this question. The first bit is concerning the different level of visitors' skill. So I guess disabilities, needs and accessibility. How does WWT manage to allow all participants, I guess, to access the site? And then the second part of that question is, how do you manage to ensure that you are giving the same messages during induction? And if there are any control measures to prevent nasty surprises. So I guess that's maybe looking at as well in terms of visual impairment, hearing impaired, those type of accessibility needs. How do you manage those?
It can be challenging, particularly because we are a natural site. We obviously do have pathways and those kinds of things. We do manage our sites, but it can be challenging to give that accessibility. And I think it's about making sure that things like when somebody arrives as a visitor, they have to go through an admissions process at most of our sites. So there's information that is given to them, leaflets, verbal information from the staff. We also, at a number of our sites, have electric wheelchairs that people can hire for the day. Certainly some of our peer colleagues have what are called trampers, and they are like very serious off-road wheelchairs. You can go anywhere in them. They're like a 4x4 wheelchair. They're absolutely fantastic. But yes, it can be challenging, particularly around things like sight difficulties. It's something that is always work in progress, I would say. In terms of, I'm just looking at your question now, what control measures do we put in place to prevent nasty surprises for the visitor? There's different ways of doing it. Some of it can be information, but if you take our sites, for example, where you have bodies of water, you have lakes and streams and those kind of things. What I don't want is for a person, particularly a child, to be walking on a path or running and turning a corner and there being suddenly a deep drop into water. I don't particularly like putting fences up. We need to design our sites to make sure that those nasty surprises are designed out. So you need to make sure that people have good vision so they can see what's ahead of them and whether it's safe to proceed. And certainly we do things like using plants, reeds and different kinds of planting around our water edges so that you can clearly see where the water line is, and that people can't just fall into it. You're using vegetation and planting as a natural barrier. So it depends on the site, but there's always work to be done around that. And one of the things that we do, both Lucy and I, is we work very closely with our peer colleagues in the industry. So other charities, other conservation and environmental charities, and really having their thoughts and visiting each other's sites really allows us to challenge ourselves. And it's very, very important that we continue to do that. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you. And I just have one final question before we wrap up today. And this is really regarding COVID, which I think, to be honest, we will be glad to see the back of. But given it's been a year of challenge, what has been the challenges at WWT?
Shall I answer that one, Lucy?
Yes, please.
It has been a challenging time. I would say the biggest challenge for us is, in the UK, you have the 4 nations, so England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. In terms of COVID law, those 4 nations are free to make their own law. So I might work out what we should and shouldn't be doing in England, but then I have to think about Scotland, then Northern Ireland, then Wales. They've all been doing it differently. And then, of course, our staff and our teams in Cambodia and Madagascar have different law as well. So I think it's just been the complexity of all of the different sites scattered around the UK and the world, really. Opening and shutting and opening and shutting. It's been a challenge. We'll get there, though.
Thank you. And on behalf of IOSH Branch Hong Kong, I'd like to thank you, Lucy and Adele, for hosting today's session. It's been intuitive and engaging, and the pictures have been fantastic. So thank you for your efforts and your hard work.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.